Nicely done once again, Wilson.
Is that good?
And Milton. Wilson is Milton's dog. All right. Oh, macro econ students, this is our second video, which will bring us up to exam 3, which is going to open tomorrow evening, and it will be open through Sunday night. I want to make sure everybody takes these exams. If you don't take the exam, a 0 is a grade killer. Okay? So, but if you haven't, something is going wrong, you have an extenuating circumstance, email me. But when I don't hear from you, then I don't know what's going on. Okay? All right. And once again, I'm going to take a picture of this, and they both will be emailed to you, so you'll have copies of this. Okay? All right. Again, hope you're all doing well, feeling good, and we're moving along on this thing. All right. So we're going to talk about the Great Recession and the Great Depression. Well, you know, they're difficult to compare. I mean, the Great Depression was so much larger and more encompassing, and in terms of severity on human suffering, it's hard to compare them in one respect. But anyway, we'll start with the Great Recession. The Great Recession, what happened? Well, as we're going to find out, when there's too much money available and the interest rates are real low and people are getting mortgages left and right with very, very moderately poor credit scores, you're going to see a bubble, and you did in the housing market. Now, coupled with that, the geniuses from New York had put together a model of the economy and saying this is the way the economy is going to operate. The only problem is that with any kind of model, you better be right with a lot of your assumptions. And they missed the mark on the default rate of homes. They thought it was going to be at this level, and it was higher. And also the fact that housing prices, which, and I have to give this to them, everyone thought this, that housing prices would never go down, they would just keep going up. But they weren't, or shouldn't have been going up as dramatically as they were in the mid-2000s. I mean, they were just skyrocketing. And people were doing just all sorts of crazy. I knew a woman who bought a house, and I knew the street, and the house was worth at most $120,000. And she said, "Oh, I just bought that house for $200,000." I thought, "Oh my gosh, you know, you really overpaid for it." And she said, "And you know what? In 6 months, I'm going to sell that house for $400,000." Well, I just give you that as an example because that's what a lot of people were doing. They were buying it, and they were just buying it to flip it, and they were all expecting a huge increase because for a short period of time, that's what was happening. The housing prices were going up and were going up. But what eventually happened? They ran out of borrowers, or borrowers like myself. I didn't need a house at that point, but we're just looking at these homes and saying, that's not worth $400,000 or $500,000. It's just not worth it. And so the borrowers were drying up. Okay? And when the borrowers dried up, all of a sudden you couldn't sell that house. And if you were just buying it with a teaser mortgage, meaning the beginning months or year of the payments were extremely low, so you could afford it, you couldn't afford to hang on to that home for the long term, for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. All right, you needed to sell it. Well, anyway, the bubble burst. And the bubble bursting in the home housing market was the key to the Great Recession, okay? All right, so some statistics. Unemployment, yeah, it did hit 10%, and we had a yearly drop in gross domestic product of almost 9%. And the thing that really, I guess, gave this the title Great Recession is that it hung on. These high unemployment rates and this low or no growth just seemed to hang on, and we were going through what was historically the slowest, most painful, if you could even call it a recovery, in the year 2012, because that's what it hung on till. Officially, they said the Great Recession lasted from 2007 to 2009, but it was really a lot longer than that. 2012 would probably be more like it, okay? And it was deeper than other recessions, so they call it the Great Recession, okay? Now, there's an old line that says, what's the difference between a recession and a depression? And the answer is, well, a recession is when your neighbor is completely out of work. A depression is when you are completely out of work. Okay, well, anyway, we had the, we're going to go to the depression in a minute. We had the housing bubble. It eventually popped. Housing prices that were astronomically high, they fell through the floor, okay? Coupled with default rates. People were defaulting on their homes. They were, they just could not even come close to paying what they owed the bank. And they were just letting it go. They were just letting their homes go. And quite honestly, it didn't even have the stigma that historically, going years and years and years back, defaulting and having your home foreclosed on was quite a negative connotation to that. But it wasn't so during the, as much during the Great Recession. But that's what was happening, okay? So, wealth, all of a sudden you thought your house was worth $500,000 and you were going to sell it for $750,000. Guess what? It's not worth that, and you're lucky if you can get $200,000. So what happened? Well, wealth went down quite a bit. Remember we talked about wealth and how do you feel? You feel poor? Well, a lot of people felt poor, and expectations went down. So what did that all caused aggregate demand to drop, and it did. It dropped quite a bit. Okay, so this led to a great drop in the financial health of especially the banking system, okay? The investment banks, the banks that were not so much commercial banks that you and I go to that used to get a toaster from, but the investment banks that were dealing with large corporations or dealing with vast amounts of money. They were investing in riskier financial instruments that they couldn't recoup quickly. And it caused a loss of confidence in even the largest the financial investment banks. So that led to a run on the banks. Now, so graphically what we're showing is the long run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, they both shifted to the left. Now the banks were rescued. Now, I would recommend a movie. I show all my macro student classes this movie. It's Too Big to Fail, and it's a fantastic movie. I would recommend that you all see it. It gives a very good accounting of what happened during this Great Recession. And then they did rescue the banks. And I'll let you watch the movie, but the long and the short of it is the money that the banks got was not loaned out to the general public, okay? Which I believe also made this recovery even more painful and slower than it should have been, all right? The banks got the money, they kept it, they gave a lot of their top folks tens of millions of dollars in bonuses, and there's a movie they even talk about, it was a documentary about why were all these folks who had done such a terrible job getting such tremendous bonuses. But that's another movie. Matt Damon is in that one. But anyway, we'll move on to the Great Depression. All right, the Great Depression, and this is probably going to be at least one of the major questions on your test on that opens up tomorrow night. Look, let's dispel a lot of, like you say, dispel a lot of the homogenized versions which are taught throughout, a lot of schools, which basically says this: well, we were moving along, everything was going pretty well, and all of a sudden, guess what? The stock market crashed. Boom! And by the way, the stock market, the date in your book needs to be corrected. In the one edition, the second edition, I have the third edition that I haven't checked if they had changed the date. But anyway, when they're talking about Black Monday was the 29th. It wasn't that Thursday. But regardless, what happened, the conventional wisdom is stock market crashed, everything went to hell, everybody lost their jobs, and we were in the Great Depression. Hoover was president. He was a hands-off president. He didn't want to be involved. He didn't want to get, his hands dirty. He didn't want to worry about the common man. They set up Hoovervilles in protest of Hoover, and he really didn't do anything. Finally, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected, and he started all these programs, and the country started clicking again and started moving again, and we're moving out and out, and all these federal programs finally got us out of the Great Depression, okay? Well, that's all fine, but majority of it is not necessarily true, all right? So here's what happened. During the Great Depression, okay, in the 1920s, you have to remember, this is the roaring 20s. You talk about a new app on your phone or this or that new product that's out. Hey, how about a phonograph? They were coming out with all sorts of, during the 1920s and 20 to 28, 29, cars, and I know they did have cars before, but now they were being mass-produced. Cars were rolling out off the assembly line. Radios, phonographs, all sorts of great new inventions. Electric irons, for gosh sakes. All these inventions. RCA were one of the top stocks. But all these new inventions, they required financial capital. So what happened? The Fed allowed the money supply to grow, and it allowed the money supply to grow by $27 billion. All right? Now, that might not sound like a lot, but it is. Even in today's economy, of course, with the plan we have to restart the economy, $27 billion doesn't sound as much as it used to. But $27 billion in a 1920s economy was huge. It was massive, okay? So you pump that much money into a 1920s economy, and guess what? You're going to have plenty of bubbles. I mean, there's just too much money for the things around. And there were bubbles all over. stocks, and they got the biggest play because they got most publicity. The stocks were big bubbles in the stock market. Florida land, California land, capital equipment market, all these bubbles were occurring all over. And again, it was just too much money being pumped into the economy too quickly, all right? And, well, guess what happened? Well, at some point they ran out of borrowers and the bubbles popped. And when they popped, they seemed to all pop together, okay? So, we had the stock market crash, and brother, did it ever crash? You know, today we look at the stock market going up and down a bit, and you know, because of this this virus that's going on, which we will beat, and we will restart the economy. Remember, what we're talking about here in the Great Depression, this happened to our economy, that the economy was moving along and it had a fundamental flaw, which was 27 billion excess dollars in the money supply. What we're incurring now, what we're experiencing now, is not a fundamental flaw. It's we are just turning the engine off, okay? And we're going to turn the engine back on, and we're going to be getting back to normal. We're going to be fine. So anyway, getting back to this. All right, so we've got the stock market crashing. We've got the, as a matter of fact, the value of the stock market, it lost almost 80 to 90% of its value in the first few years of the Great Depression. But interestingly enough, and this is probably a little known fact, from the first 6 months of the Great Depression, the stock market did go down quite a bit on that Black Monday, okay? But there's a little known fact that 6 months after that occurred, the stock market had regained almost half of its losses by President Hoover doing nothing, okay? And here's where we start diverging from what the common story of the Great Depression. Hoover wasn't an isolationist type president. He was an activist president. He was a very activist president. When they had a severe depression in 1920, which hardly anybody knows about, there was a severe one then. He was Secretary of Commerce to President Harding, and Harding didn't do anything. And the economy righted itself. But we'll get to that in a minute. All right, so Hoover was an activist president. Now, you also have to remember, at this time of the Great Depression, there wasn't macroeconomics. They didn't have anything like macroeconomics. You know, the big picture. They had microeconomics. They're taking the small view here and there. And that's exactly what happened. So Hoover said, okay, here's what we're going to do. First of all, he brings the employers in, all the major employers, and he says, I want you to do your best. I don't want to hear anybody cutting the wage rate. Although, in effect, yes, the wages did go down substantially. But in the very beginning, he said, I don't want any of you cutting the wage rate. I don't want to hear that happening. So the major corporation, heads of the corporations, okay, they were at the White House, and they left, all right? He also not only put in reverse, but I mean, he threw it in reverse in such a massive way, cutting the money supply by 30% and tightening up credit like crazy. There's one thing about if you're driving in your car and you're going too fast, there's a few different ways to stop. I mean, you can gradually come to a nice smooth stop, or you can slam on the brakes. Slamming on the brakes is usually not a good idea, unless you're about to get in an accident. All right. He passed the Revenue Act, which doubled taxes. Now, You don't double taxes, and again, hindsight is always 20/20, but you don't double taxes at the beginning of what at this point was still probably going to be just a severe recession. But he doubled taxes, and he passed the most all-encompassing, the largest tariff, Smoot-Hawley tariff in the history of the United States. It covered everything. There were only two goods that it didn't cover, and they were leeches and skeletons for medical research. Everything else, they had huge tariffs on. So what happened? Well, with such a massive tariff on everything, 27 countries almost retaliated immediately with tariffs. And now you have to remember, at this time, our farmers were still shipping overseas quite a bit of foodstuffs because, yeah, it might have been the end of the 1920s, 1929, 1930, but World War I had devastated Europe, and they were still buying an awful lot of food from us, grains. So we have that, and all of a sudden you're a farmer, and they say, hey, guess what? You just lost 30 or 40% of your market. The farmers are losing 30 or 40% of their market. The big businessmen, they go back to their companies. They're gonna pay lip service to this keeping the wage up, but they're gonna call their personnel director and say, hey, how many people do we have working for us? 4,000? Hey, guess what? Lay 2,200 off. And that's exactly what happened. People are losing their jobs. People are out of work. Farmers can't ship. Taxes are being doubled. And credit is tightening up. You can't get any credit. So what happened was, what should have been a severe recession became the Great Depression, okay? Now, Hoover was voted out and they brought in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a good man. He was trying to get this country out of the Great Depression, but again, without a good macroeconomic policy, he passed so many programs, social programs, TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. I mean, yeah, they were building hydroelectric dams here, or they were doing public works over there, all these different programs. And what was happening? Well, it would help a certain small sector of the country here and there and here and there. But was it lifting the whole economy out of the Great Depression? And the answer is no, it wasn't. One thing he did do was got the passage of the FDIC, which the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, 1933, which guaranteed funds. Now they're up to $250,000. I believe when it first started it was only $2,500, but it was to shore up the banking system and to create confidence, because before, people had lost trust in the banks. They were running to the bank to take out their funds. And could the banks give them their money? Of course they couldn't give them their money, because a bank has to make loans to stay in business. All right? So the long and the short of it was that the country was not coming out of the recession. As a matter of fact, FDR has the dubious distinction of being a president who created a minor depression in a depression. In 1937, we were still in the depression, and we had another depression in a depression. All right? So these things weren't working. Look at what was happening. Stock market down 90%. Wages down 42%. Unemployment 25%. Economic growth down 55%. And another thing, and this is what governments also they fear this probably more than inflation. Deflation of about up to 20%. Now, what does that mean for you and I? Well, we talked about inflation before, and what happens with inflation? Well, your money becomes a little worth less. Not worthless, but its purchasing power becomes smaller and smaller, all right? So what do you try to do? You try to get out of money. You try to find another asset that will keep up with inflation. Deflation is just the opposite. Your money is appreciating. Every day, your money is becoming more and more valuable. Now, it's not as if the poor folks back in the early 30s had a whole heck of a lot of money to begin with, but their money, however little that they had of it, was worth a little bit more, every day. So what that meant was that they were very reluctant to purchase anything. They would wait till the very last day, even purchasing things like milk or some basic necessity. They would hold onto that dollar till the very end. And why? Because the dollar was appreciating. Okay? So, you've got that going on. And you've got all these other things. People are out of work. Well, again, think of it. John Maynard Keynes says, well, there was a lack of aggregate demand. Well, you bet your life there was a lack of aggregate demand. Think of it. If you were just laid off from your job, let's take a step back from before we're saying, okay, we don't have much aggregate demand. Well, let's take a step back. You just got laid off from your job. Your spouse got cut down to 28 hours a week. Can you afford to support your family, your children on that? The answer is no. You bet your life there was lack of aggregate demand, but there was a lack of aggregate demand because the businesses were laying off like crazy, and people were holding on to what few dollars that they had left. All right, so question comes down to it. Should government have acted? Well, yes, but let's finish the story. And you're going to need to remember this for the third exam, because it's all going to be part of it. What finally got us out of the Great Depression? Was it some brainchild act or some great idea that Franklin Delano Roosevelt came up with that, he didn't come up with in 1933, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. No, it was World War II. World War II took us out of the Great Depression because it involved such an all-encompassing, massive government program cutting clear across the economy. It was a type of macro program that they didn't even realize. And it was a huge spending. Yes, it was a government spending program, but it cut clear across. It wasn't a little spending here, a little spending there, and there. It was across the board, massive government spending, and it took us out, but it wasn't until end of 1942, maybe even the very, very beginning of 1943, till we were out of the Great Depression. Now, that took us out of the Great Depression, but God forbid that we have to have a world war, especially World War II, where we had 60 plus million people died. That's a heck of a way to try to find a solution for a Great Depression. Anyway, should governments act? Comes out we have Keynes and we have the classical economists. We're just giving you the snapshot of it now. We could go in more detail, but this is a snapshot. Keynes says absolutely. Keynes is very big on government spending. He thought monetary policy was okay, but he was big on fiscal policy. Government spending, and we do things in the short term, in the short run. Okay? He was very, very big on the short run. Because, as a famous quote from him says, because in the long run, we're all dead. Which, it makes sense. And when you think about it, yeah, I mean, the classical economists are saying, in the long run, the economy will self-correct and everything will be, getting back to normal in the long run. But the problem is, if it's the Great Depression, you come home at night and you've got, 3 or 4 kids looking at you and they want to know, what's for dinner tonight? What are we having for dinner tonight? Is there anything in the cupboards for dinner? They don't want to hear, oh, don't worry, in a year or two, in the long run, the economy is going to self-correct, everything's going to be fine. No, we do live in the short run, okay? Now, but with that being said, so I have to give some credit to Keynes. Yes, we do live in the short run. However, we also have to say that the classicals aren't entirely off the mark either, because they refer to that depression in 1920, which was actually quite severe, very, very brief, but it was quite severe. President Harding didn't do anything. And Hoover was his Secretary of Commerce, and Hoover was urging him to do this, do that. He didn't do anything. And oddly enough, the economy did self-correct, okay? So by 1921, pretty much out, 1922, definitely out of it. So to their credit, we have to give a little credence to what the classical economists are saying. However, and having had 9 children, you don't want to come home to 9 children, they want to know what's for dinner, and you're going to tell them, don't worry, in the long run, the economy is going to self-correct. So the conclusion maybe is a little bit of both. We have government action with effective macroeconomic policies. Now, again, they didn't have macroeconomics during the Great Depression. This huge, all-encompassing government spending program that involved every aspect of the economy. Yeah, that was a macro program. So nowadays we do have macroeconomics, and the use of some macroeconomic tools, which we'll talk about even more next week, would be in line, again, with some constraint. Okay? All right. Well, that takes us through now to exam 3, and I hope everybody has a nice weekend and you do well, and I will see you all next week.